Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 34th episode of the Manor Podcast. I'm your co-host, Bodee, joined as always with my best friend and other co-host, Michael Hamilton. Michael, what are you most looking forward to about the Outsider set that we perfectly called and have perfectly mastered at this point in time now as well, I'm assuming?
Perfectly mastered Outsiders?
Yeah, we already know draft pick orders and stuff like that, I assume. Yeah.
I am really excited for both new CC meta, where there will be several new heroes to solve or figure out, and I'm also really excited to have a new draft format. I think while Dynasty was, in my opinion, a solid set for a supplemental sets kind of suck compared to full sets. You don't get new heroes, you don't get a draft. I'm really excited.
We got a new hero in the last supplemental set. What are you talking about? And we got a new hero in the last supplemental set too.
You don't get real...
We got 2 new heroes. We got 3 new heroes. 4 new heroes in Everfest.
You get 1 adult hero usually, I guess. The last 2 supplemental sets have had 1 adult hero.
We had Genus.
That's
the Genus, the Merchant. I guess Valda's a young hero.
Health. Genus has 20.
He doesn't? Oh, he's a young guy? He's an old young guy. I guess it's kind of like young Oldham's still old too. How could they have ever made a young Oldham? You know?
Young him.
These are the real questions that LSS needs to answer.
Because if you just had adult Oldheim unlimited, it would not be a thing you could do.
Yeah, but then if he's not Oldheim anymore, he's just Heim, right? He should have just been young Heim. Yeah.
What are you most excited for about Outsiders?
I'm most excited for the dual class cards and seeing all of the interesting ways that they're going to start hybridizing the class combinations. Eventually, if they continue down this path, there'll be some really sweet combinations and things that will be more and more opened up for the existing heroes as well as heroes in the future. So I guess interestingly, in the future, every assassin hero will have got access to these assassin ranger cards, and every ranger will have access to these assassin ranger cards. So it's just really interesting ways for helping out different class card pools. And I'm interested to see how they're going to find the commonalities between the 2 classes and push them. Because that was what was really interesting about Magic dual cards when they started doing 2 colors, 3 colors, stuff like that, is you would find the common elements between one color and another color, or even in enemy colors, they're called colors that are supposed to be opposites, red and blue usually focus on spells matter kinds of things. So it'll be interesting to find well, what do warriors and wizards care about? I don't know.
What's the overlap?
Not that they're in the next set, but eventually.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I also think it's pretty cool talking about these dual cards. Is it does a lot to expand the card pool and make drafting pretty good. In Welcome to Wraith, we had a bunch of generics that made the draft format good, and then in Aria we had these typed cards that made the draft format really good, where you could take an ice card and it would work in 2 heroes that were close to generics, but not quite, because they would work at 2/3 the decks. And this format seems really similar with these hybrid cards. They'll work in 2/3 the decks. I'm very excited for limited.
I would say almost everything on our Outsiders limited wish list is going to come true. So, LSS, if you ever need good designers, you know how to get in touch. I guess speaking of design, though, so our main topic today comes at a request of one of our patrons, and a lot last month we spent a lot of time focusing on values of cards and trying to ensure that you maximize the value. And obviously with attacks, defense reactions, attack reactions, the cards that are just genuine numbers that are pretty straightforward to evaluate. But they asked us to kind of look at some of the more unique heroes, their abilities in their card pools, as to why their value might not quite be there at the moment and how you should be evaluating them as they're currently designed. So that's going to be what Michael and I are going to be putting together today. So if you are not a fan of Rhinar, Dorinthea, or Dromai, I'm sorry, I don't think this podcast is going to be for you.
Well, I think kind of walking through how we evaluate value on these three heroes will also kind of give you hopefully a better framework for evaluating trickier spots. I'm hoping.
Okay, so even if you're not a fan of Rhinar, Dromai, or Dorinthea, this podcast is for you.
Yeah, if you like one of those three heroes or Fab Math.
You don't like one of those three heroes,
either
do. Way. It's great.
Okay.
It's a great podcast episode.
So
do you want to start with first, Michael?
Let's start with Dorinthea. So Dorinthea has a couple things that make her cards not always consistent in value. So when you attack with your Dorinthea cards, several, like, if you have like a blue plus a Warrior's Valor, and you pitch your blue to play Warrior's Valor, attack with Dawnblade for 6. If the Dawnblade hits, it gains both Go Again, and it also gets Dorinthea's ability will trigger to let you attack again. So if you get that hit, you get attack for 3 more also. The first kind of question mark in evaluating Dorinthea's card value is the Dawnblade hitting with the first attack? If it has, because if it has Go Again, you really need to hit for Dorinthea's ability, and there's also these cards that are conditional Go Again. When I'm trying to look at a Dorinthea hand and evaluate it, I want to calculate how much value I'm going to get if the Dawnblade doesn't hit, if they just block it out, and how much value it's going to get if it does hit. So with that example with Warrior's Valor, you get 9 if the first Dawnblade attack hits the first attack for 6. You'll get 3 more for 9. And if it gets blocked, you'll get 6 points of value. And that's kind of where you start from. And then you want to try to figure out what the chance of it being blocked are versus the chance of it being not blocked are. So if you know this attack is never hitting this first attack for 6, then it's not super valuable to keep these 2 cards. Because spending 2 cards for 6 points of damage, 2 cards and an action point for 6 points of damage is not great. And if your opponent is a deck with all block 3s that is happy to block and you don't have a way to push that first attack over, then you know you're just going to get the 6 points of value if you attack with it. You might as well block, or you could also just block with the 2 cards to save 6 life.
I think a lot of what you just discussed, though, is kind of what the cards are on their face, but a lot of the warrior cards are dependent on what your opponent does. I guess in Magic we call them Punisher effects, where your opponent gets to decide whether or not you get the full value of the card. Basically, if your opponent doesn't block and you have a reprise card in your hand, like Iron Song Response most infamously, you have a card that does nothing. And so how do you evaluate a card? Is Iron Song Response then worth 1.5 when you attack with it? Or I guess, do you want to go into that?
Yeah, so I wouldn't value it at 1.5. Most opponents, they're either more likely to block or less likely to block. Like if you're playing against Fi who really doesn't want to block, then a lot of the time your Iron Song Response won't be turned on because they're blocking, or any of your reprise effects won't be turned on because a deck like Fi isn't going to block you that often. Whereas against a deck like Oldheim, you might expect them to block almost every turn because Oldheim is just naturally pretty defensive and has a lot of 3 blocks and usually cannot use 4 or 5 card hands super effectively on offense. So generally Oldheim is inclined to block with some cards. So you want to...
So it's worth 0 versus Fi and 3 versus Oldheim?
Well, it's basically worth 3 when it's turned on. And it's worth 0 when it's not turned on. So you want to know how likely they are to block or not block, and that'll kind of
So it's worth 2.67 versus Oldheim and 0.33 versus Fi. When you factor in their likelihood of percentage to block.
It's either worth 3 or 0, but you want to try to make an educated guess on which one it'll be when both deck building and choosing how to sequence your blocks and your attacks on your turn. So I think the best way to look at it all is when you're attacking with Dawnblade, you kind of have like 4 real possibilities of what could happen. Either it could miss, they could block it out and reprise could be turned on. It could hit and reprise could be turned on. Or Reprise cannot be turned on and it hits, or reprise not turned on and it gets blocked. And usually if it's blocked out, reprise will be turned on. So that one where it's blocked out and reprise is not turned on, that only really happens if they have a defense reactant arsenal or they have a lot of armor. So that one's like one you can, I don't want to say rule out, but like be very aware or try to like figure out how they can do that if that's something you're worried about. And then of those 4 possibilities, you kind of,
or if they have like an enchanting melody in play, right? The very playable good card, enchanting melody.
Yeah, they could have. Yeah, I don't know how I forgot about that card. It's such a commonly played card, such a powerful effect.
All over the meta right now, so it's okay.
I think every enchanting melody I've seen in a tournament has been in one of your decks.
I'm just a genius innovator then at that point, then I guess. Ahead of the curve.
So, but I guess the value of your cards, you can add up what it'll be in each of these cases, and when you actually go to play your turn, one of those 4 cases will be what actually happens, and you'll see what the value is on your turn when you actually play your cards. But you basically try to predict which case it'll be with Dorinthea. It's not really like your cards are ever worth like fractions of value. It's either you just won't know which condition or how your opponent will react until you attack. And that's part of why Dorinthea struggles against players that know Dorinthea really well, is they can generally block in a way to prevent your cards from getting maximum value and put you in spots where there isn't really a good way to get maximum value out of all of your cards, because they have a lot of control over which of these 4 scenarios happens.
I guess from like a design perspective, all attack reactions kind of have a point usually shaved off, right? And I guess from that perspective, when we were also discussing like attack reactions, since it's like they consider it unblockable damage, since it can only be stopped by like prevention effects or defense reactions at that point. So does that lead to some inefficiencies in the damage output of Dorinthea in that case then?
Yeah.
When the attack reaction damage isn't really worth much?
It does, but
specific matchups, I guess.
Since the on hit of Dawnblade hitting is so powerful, I guess, like getting to attack again. If you pitch a blue and play Red Warrior's Valor and attack with your Dawnblade and it doesn't get blocked, then you attack again and it doesn't get blocked, you're getting a 2 card for 9. And then I guess the last thing about Dorinthea that we didn't really talk about is +1 counters. But you're spending 2 cards for 9 damage and you're getting a +1 counter on the Dawnblade, which is worth at least 1 damage the following turn and potentially more. So because of that, like these attack reactions that kind of push damage over that your opponent can't block, you kind of like get to see how they block before you play the defense or the attack reactions. Like if they overblock by 3, you just don't play your Iron Song response. You can arsenal or whatever.
And they get stuck in your arsenal the whole game, and then you never get another chance to play it. Yeah, I've played Dorinthea before.
It happens. It happens. Sometimes your Iron Song response is in your arsenal for the whole game, and you die. But part of why Dory's not great.
Easy.
The damage being something that your opponent can't block with normal cards is why they are usually kind of inefficient. Iron Song response, 0 for 3, doesn't cost an action point. It's at rate if the reprise is turned on. And if the reprise is not turned on, it's worth 0, which is useless.
Right, yeah. But then how do they justify then a card like Sharpened Steel? Because that's just always a 0 for 3, but that's like non-attack action that your opponent has full information beforehand. So that's kind of the frustrating thing I would think about Warriors' non-attack actions is before Glistening Steelblade, I felt like they were kind of priced inappropriately to a certain degree as well. I guess the common saying is that they are already factoring Dawnblade having a +1 counter, or your weapon already being pumped, or maybe there's a future super scary weapon that needed to nerf all of these non-attack actions beforehand. But that's just something that I don't really buy, given that like it's just so below rate most of the time with these non-attack actions.
Sure, Sharpened Steel is a 0 for 3, right? Or 0, give your weapon +3.
Yeah, 0 for 3.
Blocks 3.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not really below rate, because the rate you're expecting is 3 points per card +1 for your action point. So trading a card for 3 points of damage, that's at rate when it's not costing your action point.
I thought that was at rate for limited, but not for constructed. At limited, you want to go, or in constructed, you want to go higher.
Yeah, like that is at rate, and then in constructed you want to do things that are above rate, because that's kind of the power level of the constructed format. Is if everyone's just playing at rate, then like there's cards that go above rate, and that's what we talk about with like 0-for-4s with Go Again, or
yeah. So I consider 0-for-4 or Go Again the class constructed power level rate.
Okay. I would say that's above rate. If you get 17 points of value out of your hand, then you're doing out of a 4-card hand. That's reasonably above rate, I would say.
How are you getting 17 out of 4 4s?
Well, you get your action points though. Your action points worth 1.
I guess. I'm not really satisfied with where we're leaving things. But
Okay. Let's talk some more. What are you not satisfied with?
So I guess ultimately what I was trying to get at there, or maybe I said, was that the reason that Dorinthea struggles at like getting the Michael Hamilton rate most of the time is because, like I was saying, is that the attack reactions are priced at a premium because it's unblockable damage, and the warrior non-attack actions are all tucked down a peg in power level because their power level is going to be associated with whatever weapon is getting the buff from the non-attack action. So in both cases, the cards are under rate because they're assuming that the weapon or the hero ability or something else is going to then pick them back up to be about where the card should be for a constructed level card. What winds up happening, though, is that people actually play the game of Flesh and Blood in a way that they will minimize the impact of your non-attack actions and attack reactions. And when that happens, you're not actually getting the bonuses that they might have actually intended you to get for these attack reactions or non-attack actions. And I think that's what hurts Dorinthea specifically the most, as far as like what her playability and power level is at this point in time. It's just that, I guess, like even before like Glistening Steelblade, and Glistening Steelblade's so good is because it just carries those +1/+1 counters for so many future turns, or threatens to, that it becomes untenable for your opponent to even be able to start mitigating your cards. But at just their default rate in Dawnblade at 3 power, it's usually pretty easy to manage for most decks in the format. Anything that I said that's controversial or you disagree with?
I do still disagree with, like, I think Sharpened Steel isn't below rate. Like, if you look at cards that are 0-for-4 that don't take your action points, so 0-for-4 with Go Again, if you look at most of them are like Soaring Gloomveil and Revel in Ruinblood are both very conditional. Even Scar for Scar is conditional, Ravenous Rebel's conditional. All these things that are 0-for-4s with Go Again are conditional cards. And Sharpened Steel's condition is you attack with a weapon. So not really conditional. And you look at like, even like Nimblism is another example of like, it's kind of like the same rate as Sharpened Steel where it's 0-for-3.
I guess that's fair, but I guess when you're playing Nimblism, getting the +3 power, that can be tied to any attack action in the future or history of the game that can be buffed by it. Whereas weapons, so that means a bunch of on-hit effects that can potentially go through because of that, and other cascading effects that happen because of those attacks getting powered or buffed or something like that. Whereas weapons don't really have the same value from getting buffed at this point in time as actions. And it would take a lot for a weapon to be as good as, I guess, like attack actions are getting buffed in order to justify their rate. And I don't know that Dawnblade is at that level.
Yeah, that's probably true. That's why cards like Glistening Steelblade are good, I guess, is because Dawnblade's on hit isn't good enough by itself. But when you put Glistening Steelblade in the deck and suddenly you're getting a +1 counter on your weapon every time it hits this turn, then now suddenly that on hit is worth a ton of damage over the course of the game.
Yeah, exactly. And so I guess if we just even think about it, like even if Dawnblade was just naturally like 4 power, we'll say, I think then giving it all of like the +3 effects, perfectly fine. Like I wouldn't want there to be effects that are, higher power. I guess it's like, where do you want the power level of the cards to rest, maybe ultimately is like the argument to be made. Do you want it to rest in like the non-attack, like the cards that are played in the deck? Or do you want it to rest on like the power level of the equipment themselves? And maybe it's just easier to manage the equipment from like a design perspective because there's just not usually a lot of like weapons per class, and they will rotate with their respective heroes. Like eventually Dawnblade just won't even be playable. Dorinthea is the only warrior that can play, or Bolton can technically, but without Dorinthea's hero ability, Dawnblade's atrocious. So I don't know. There's just a lot to consider, I guess. And I guess maybe ultimately my gripe is that I'm just underwhelmed with all of the current options for warrior weapons. So
I think Dawnblade is reasonably powerful. One cost for 3 damage. Is 1 point short of Rosetta Thorn, but it does have this like nice ability where if you hit with it twice, you get that +1 counter, and Dorinthea can make it hit twice. So like there is some value there. It's not like a bad weapon per se, but it's just
sure. But if we factor in the premium of arcane damage, where arcane damage is usually put at a premium, like Rosetta Thorn's not just 1 for 4, it's like 1 for 4 plus because it's also spread across 2 instances of the 2 damage. So
yeah,
I don't think Dawnblade and Rosetta Thorn are even like remotely close in terms of like power level.
Yeah,
but that's not saying much because I think Rosetta Thorn's broken.
yeah. One point of value is a lot. And you mentioned this like premium for arcane damage, but it's weird because Runeblades have never paid the premium for their arcane damage. Wizards always pay it. Wizards are like, if I want to deal three arcane damage, it's gonna take my action point and a full card. Whereas Runeblades, like they have like Vexing Malice and Arcanic Crackle that are just like outright cards that some of the damage is arcane damage. There's one from Arya, the 1 for 4 that deals 1 arcane damage also.
I guess the reason why that is like I think the 1 ping of arcane damage is never put at a premium because the requirements to putting AB1 in your package in order to mitigate that arcane damage and the requirements putting like AB5 for your deck requirements in deck space are a lot different. And I guess that's also then what makes Rosetta Thorn especially egregious, is most people are just bringing AB1 into, these Runeblade matchups, and then here's Rosetta Thorn saying, like, actually, I have 2 arcane damage, and it's like, I'm not bringing our AB2 for Rosetta Thorn. Like, okay, you got me,
Yeah, we could definitely talk about Runeblade design for a while. I think there's a lot of stuff going on there that isn't necessarily the best, but I'm not sure. It's
okay. They're not going to make Runeblades anymore. They haven't made Runeblades in like, 3 whole sets now? That's a long time, buddy.
Friar's going to living legend, and then they're going to be like, we need a new Runeblade. We don't have any Runeblades that are playable because Viscerai's going to lose Rosetta Thorn, which should have been elemental anyway. But anyway,
let's talk about Rhinar.
Yeah, let's talk about Rhinar. So I think Rhinar actually isn't. There's not a lot of weird things in Rhinar. The biggest thing is the value of Intimidate. There's 2 ways that Intimidate can generate value. If your opponent just wasn't going to block you anyway and was just going to use their whole hand offensively, Intimidate literally isn't doing anything. Because if they were planning to say no blocks, if you intimidate their hand, they're still just going to say no blocks. So and the value of Intimidate really only comes in when it's either turn 0 and they were going to block because it's turn 0, or it's pushing lethal, making them unable to block when you actually kill them. So like the start and the end of the game. And then the other spot that it is useful is when you're making your opponent's turn less efficient. If you look at, like, for example, an Oldheim hand, and let's say you have 3/3 blocks and an ice card, and the way you want to use your hand is block with the 3/3 blocks and pitch your ice card to attack with Rhinar Wheel. Pretty typical Oldheim play pattern. If you intimidate 2 of these 3 blocks, now the Oldheim can block with 1 of the 3 blocks, the one that's left, and then they can either block with their ice card or like whatever they do with the other 3 cards. Now they have to like recalculate their hand to use those cards. So like maybe their new best play is attack with this 6 for 8 that got intimidated away, so they can pitch 2 blues and attack for 8 and block for 3, so a total value of 11. Whereas if they got to use their hand the way they wanted to, they would block with 3 blocks for 9 and then attack with Rhinar Wheel for 4, so that would be 13. So in that scenario, you are reducing the value of the Oldheim's hand by 2 because you intimidated in a way that made him unable to block in an efficient way.
So the issue with Rhinar is that the most common way he generates Intimidate is that he has to discard a card with 6 or more power. And in your example, if your value of your Intimidate is worth 2, you then just traded a card for a value of 2, and that does not seem worth it. Even in the situation, that seems like the best case scenario for him in this instance. So I guess, do you want to talk about like how that value could be made up in other ways then in those kinds of matchups, or what's happening there?
Yeah, so I guess if you look at so to figure out what the value of the card you're discarding is, you actually have to look at the cards you're playing, because discard is usually an additional cost to play the card. If you look at like Alpha Rampage, you have to discard to play Alpha Rampage, right? I'm thinking of the right card.
Yeah.
Okay.
3 for 9, discard a card.
Yeah, okay. So if you look at Alpha Rampage, you're paying 2 cards as the cost for it. You're paying the 3 cost to play and the card you have to discard. And then plus the Alpha Rampage itself. So 3 cards and your action point. And you're getting 2 Intimidates and 9 damage, basically. So if you look at it just like, if you ignore the Intimidates, you're spending 3 cards and your action point for 9 damage, which is slightly below rate because we're looking for...
Below rate.
Yeah, we're looking for each card to be worth 3 and your action point to be worth 1. So 3 cards plus an action point should be worth 10. So these 2 Intimidates you're getting out of it, they need to make up that 1 point of value to get 2 rate. And ideally for classic constructed play, you want to be above that rate, because otherwise your decks just will be able to beat draft decks, and that's about it. Because every constructed deck's doing something above rate for the most part. So
except for Bolt.
Even Bolton can usually beat 13 a turn cycle. Lumina Ascension is a real card.
I was just memeing. Go.
Via the Vanguard.
I was
also.
memeing. It's okay.
So
we're not talking about Bolton though. It's all right.
So these you can kind of value the Intimidate based on how much it reduces the value of your opponent's hand, and you kind of compare that to, or that's kind of just how you figure out the value of your Alpha Rampage. This Intimidate, if the Intimidate reduces your opponent's hand value by 1, then this Alpha Rampage is worth 10. If it reduces their hand value by 2, it was worth 11.
So let's say though I rolled Scabskin Leathers on this turn, and I have 2 action points, and then I follow up the Alpha Rampage with a swing of Club for 5. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that Alpha Rampage is about the Intimidate triggers off of Alpha Rampage need to get less value, since I'm not necessarily giving up like my only action point to do this anymore?
So it's kind of tricky because Club, like or Scabskin specifically, you're taking this risk to generate additional action points. So when you roll the 2
Gambler's Glove, there's no risk.
When you roll the 2 action points on Scabskin Leathers, like you're only rolling them if you can get value out of additional action points, because otherwise you're just like risking ruin for no value. So at that point you kind of have to evaluate the whole hand together, where you're playing Alpha Rampage and you're attacking with Club, so you're spending 4 total cards for 14 damage, and you're still getting these 2 Intimidate triggers, right? Because you play the Alpha Rampage, and then you swing Club is 9 plus 5. Yeah. So you kind of
14.
I think
checks out.
I think you just have to evaluate it as like,
is it the difference between the Scabskins hitting and not hitting? Is it the independent values of Scabskin rolling 0, 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, and 6, and then you have to evaluate all those different percentages, weigh them in, carry the derivative forward to the Alpha Rampage, and then we got the value, right? Yeah. So, did I do it right? How many decimal points did I round to?
The Scabskins roll is actually something completely separate from the Alpha Rampage. So if you look at your hand and you want to calculate the value of it, if you have 1 action point, if you have 2 action points, if you have 3 action points, and if you have 0 action points. And you can pretty reasonably know that rolling Scabskins, you're 1 and 6 to get 0 action points, 2 and 6 to get 1 action point, 2 and 6 to get 2 action points, and 1 and 6 to get 3 action points. So you can see what the value of your hand is in the different possible outcomes of rolling different values on the scabskin leathers. And basically you want to take probably the average outcome, which is weighted by the chance of getting each outcome. And that's like what your hand's worth if you don't block, and then compare that to if you do block, what the average value would be if you just use your hand. Maybe you don't roll scabskins and your average is just whatever it would be instead of taking an average.
Do you recommend brute players start bringing out graphing paper with them then to start calculating out all these values in real time?
So I don't think you're allowed to do that, but honestly, when you're going through your replays, you should actually take some time to do the math on what the expected value of these different hands are with different scabskin leather rolls. And then when you have similar hands in the tournaments or even the same hand, then you can just, you'll just know what the right line is because you did the work beforehand, basically. Because you won't have time to do all of this in a tournament. It takes a while to do scabskin math.
I was just thinking, I was like, is there rules in Flesh and Blood against doing math at the table? And because I know there's like rules on like what you can and like you can't write down your opponent's like pitch stack and stuff like that. There's rules on notes and stuff like that. I thought you were specifically talking about a rule that says like you can't do long division or like stats on a piece of paper at the table. You were just talking about like time, and I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah. I don't actually know what the note taking rules are. I could see if you're doing like math or like complicated math on your thing. You're like, okay, 1 in 6 times 13 damage, and then 2 in 6 times 12 damage. Like if you're doing that on the side, I could see that's not being allowed for reasons outside of time reasons. I don't know what you're allowed to write down that falls under note taking, because I don't know. I'd have to look into the rules on note taking, because I know you're allowed to write your opponent's name.
We gotta call Josh Scott up.
You're allowed to write who goes first, and you can write life totals. But what else can you write on a piece of paper while you're playing? I don't actually know.
Can you write down your digits next time we're playing so I can call you next time, maybe?
You already have my number.
Oh yeah, that's right.
I can't wait very well.
Anyways, any final concluding thoughts on Brutes and Rhinar then? I feel like I don't know if we've cleared anything up, but we sure talked about Brute a lot.
So there's a couple other cards that I'll touch on, because Rhinar has a couple of cards that are like a little bit complicated, I guess. Not super complicated, but like there's definitely some evaluations. So Barraging Beatdown is a card that we already know how to figure out the value of the Intimidate from Barraging Beatdown. And then basically it has the two cases of they block with 2 or more cards to turn off the plus power ability, or they don't. And you can kind of, similar to Dorinthea, you can figure out what the value is if they do block with 2 cards versus what the value is if they don't block with 2 cards, and kind of go from there about figuring out how much value it'll likely be if you play it. And then, if they block with 2 cards, it's worth 0 value. Or if you're using a single Barrage Beatdown on a weapon like a claw, then you threatening this extra damage means if they block with 2 cards, they're probably overblocking the base value of 3 on the claw. So you're getting a little bit of extra value there too. If that makes sense. I guess
it makes sense. I still have no idea. For the man who tells people to just look at the value of the hands and get the value, I feel like you just throw around the word value in its definition a lot. It's like,
okay. So if I cast Barraging Beatdown and then I attack you with not Romping Claw. What's the claw called? Mandible Claw. If I cast Red Barraging Beatdown and attack with Mandible Claw, then I'm attacking for either 7 or 3. So if you block with no cards, I'm getting 7 points of value. If you block with 2 cards, then you're going to block the entire damage, but you're spending 2 cards on it. So basically, like this barrage.
Are you getting 3 value then? Would you consider the overblock your positive value?
Yes, I think that's a simple
because it's negative value for your opponent
to look at it. Because your opponent now has to overblock because they can't cover up all the damage with just a 3 block. So their second card if they block with 2 cards, it's basically covering up the barraging beatdown plus. So
are they getting plus value out of their hand then? Because that means their card's technically where one card's blocking 4. The second card, or is it in between that? Is it getting a value of 2 because it's the difference between 0 and 4?
It's not the difference between 0 and 4. There's no averages. You don't split it. So basically, barraging beatdown is, I guess, the barraging beatdown is worth whatever your opponent's hand would have been if they didn't block with the 2 cards minus the.
But why are we evaluating barraging beatdown like this, where it's just like barraging beatdown is this card that's like 0 for 4, which is like our most go-to thing in like Flesh and Blood so far. Mm-hmm. And we don't say, well, the 0 for 4 is worth whatever the difference is between whether or not your opponent blocks with it, doesn't block with it, or like covers it all up. It's just like barraging beatdown is either worth, it's always worth 4, but what you're doing is you're allowing your opponent to get extra value out of their hand by committing the second card. So I was actually wrong when I said it was negative value for your opponent. It's actually still positive value for your opponent. You're actually increasing the value of their second card blocking for 3 to a second card blocking for 4 instead.
Okay, yeah, that is a good way to word that and a good way to look at it. I agree. That's much better than whatever I was trying to say.
Okay.
So
look at that. I'm learning. You're teaching me this whole way through. You could even teach a big dum-dum like me along the way.
So the last Rhinar card that I want to talk about is Bloodrush Bellow, because it's like a card that usually is responsible for some pretty good turns, but it's pretty hard to figure out the exact value of it. The only real way that you can evaluate it is after you play and finish resolving the card, you can kind of count up how much damage you did that turn. So maybe you spend 4 cards for 19 damage or 3 cards for 15 damage or something like that. And you won't be able to know how much damage you're going to get from your Bloodrush Bellow turn before you play the card, because you're going to draw 2 random cards, and those 2 random cards are like a very big part of how much damage you get. If you get at least a single blue to swing both claws and do something else, that's probably going to be a better turn than if you just draw 2 more reds and you can't really use your hand super effectively. So there's some unknowns when you play Bloodrush Bellow, but yeah, it's usually pretty strong. The only real way to know the total value or the average value of it would be running the simulation thousands of times and seeing what value you got out of your Bloodrush Bellow hands over all those games. But in general, it's usually Bloodrush Bellow turns are usually above rate, so you usually want to do what you can to play it. Go.
So, are they above rate? Because you have to think about it. Like, let me hit you with this.
Okay.
You're spending a card to pitch, spending a card to discard.
Mm-hmm.
So you have 2 cards. And then, so that means, you're spending a card to play. So you're spending 3 cards. 3 cards here so far. You're getting 2 back. So that means you've spent 1 card. So that means you need to attack 2 times in order for it to be at rate, because then you'll have used 1 card for 4, right?
So you aren't spending 3 cards. If you pitch a blue to play it, you're spending the 2 cards, the card that you play plus the card that you discard, and then 1/3 of the last card, because you're only spending 1 of the 3 resources. If you can use all 3 of the resources.
I need to go back and watch some of our episodes. I feel like this is a sneaky thing you do, where sometimes a pitch is a card, and sometimes a pitch isn't a card, and sometimes a blue's a card, and sometimes a blue isn't a card, and sometimes a yellow's a card, but it's also not a card, but it's not an efficient card. And it's just like, I feel like there's all of these little sneaky things that you restate the same things just slightly enough to fit whatever context you need. I'm not sure about it. I need to go back and watch these things, but I just have this feeling that, like, when I say it's a card, you're like, no, it's not a card. It's a fraction of a resource. And they're like, oh, okay. Well, this is a fraction of a resource. You're like, no, that's a card. And I'm like,
so
what? Why do I always get it wrong? Why am I always the dumb, Michael?
It matters if you're going to be able to spend your other resources or not. If you pitch a card to play a 1-cost thing that also costs your action point, then you're going to not be able to do anything with those 2 extra resources. So you're spending 2 cards for it. Like, I guess the most common example is you pitch a card to play Command and Conquer. You're spending 2 cards for 6 points of damage. And a lot of the time you're pitching a blue and wasting 1 resource. But since you can't spend that resource on anything, then you're just spending 2 cards for 6 damage. Whereas if you play something with Go Again, like this Blood Rush Bellow, then you have those 2 resources floating, and you already know you're going to have a claw that you could use to spend these 2 resources on, plus whatever you draw, you can also spend these resources towards. So you're not, like, they're not wasted because your action point's not going away. You're still going to have an action point, so you'll be able to spend the 2 resources.
I'll let it slide for now. Like I said, I'm going to go back to the tapes. I'm going to review. I'm going to study hard. I'm going to take notes. And I'm going to come back with factual, lawyer-based evidence in order to make my case next time. But so you better watch out, buddy.
Yeah, find my contradictions. All right. Ready to move on from Rhinar?
Phoenix Wright your ass.
It's been a while since I played a Phoenix Wright game.
Yeah, but we can talk about Dromai now. That's fine.
All right. So Dromai has 2 kind of question marks. So the first one is the value of an ash, and the second one's going to be value of a dragon. So I think the value of an ash kind of has to be tied to the value of a dragon, because ash by itself, it's not doing anything. Like if you take Oldheim and you're like, well, now you have this card that makes 30 ash, then it doesn't do anything because the ash don't do anything by themselves. So the way that you calculate the value of a dragon is basically how much it attacks for and how much damage they need to use to clear, or they end up using to clear. So the easy example is probably something like Mirror Guy. If you play a Mirror Guy and you attack with it, you get 2 damage, and then you need to send 4 damage back to kill it. So Mirror Guy, if you play Mirror Guy and attack with it, you do 2 damage, and then on their turn they send a 4 power attack at it and kill it. Then you got 6 points of value out of it because you attacked for 2, and then it prevented 4 damage that you would have taken.
Okay, I'm on board.
There are some things that are added to make that more complicated, but that's kind of a good base point, is you're getting your 6 points of value there. So that's how much value you get for the card. And then the cost of playing Mirror Guy is, first, you need the full card, the Invoke Mirror Guy card. You need an ash to put under the Mirror Guy because you can't cast the Mirror Guy without an ash. And then you need that 1 resource to pay for the Mirror Guy. So figuring out how you're getting the resource and the ash is like the weird question mark, because it's not a normal resource that everyone has access to.
You said it. You did the thing. You've been waiting for you avoided my trap card, which was going to be, I thought we discussed this before. I think it was just a Discord message. I don't think it was in like person, where somebody asked like what the value of like an ash is. And I thought we both came to the consensus that it's just an alternative resource. And it's almost like, imagine like you pitch a card. I guess we don't have to imagine. It's what Dromai does most of the time, where a red pitches for the 1 resource and the 1 dragon resource. And this dragon resource, instead of going away at the end of your turn and losing it, this dragon resource just gets to sit there on the battlefield being a dragon resource. And it's worth nothing if you, just like any other resource, if you never use it. But once you use it, it is then, it realizes its resource value and then can be counted towards a point of value, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so...
Cool.
So, I guess...
Because I think that's the most succinct way to describe ash. Mm-hmm. They're just an alternative resource that don't accrue any value until they are actualized into a dragon.
Yeah, so when you're playing Dromai, when you pitch a red, you get 1 regular resource, and you get 1 of these dragon resources that you were talking about. And that dragon resource is worth something, assuming you convert it into a dragon or do something productive with it. But if you end the game with 5 ash in play, those 5 ash were useless. They did not generate any value. When you pitched those 5 reds, then to make those 5 ash, or however you made them, you didn't. Those were 5 extra, basically wasted resources you did not use efficiently. So
yeah, but to that end, though, I would say that you look at the dragon cards and the resources used to cast them independently at that point. So basically like a card like Sweeping Blow. So it's 1 for 3 that gets you dragon resource, as we're saying. So if you just cast a Sweeping Blow and never make a dragon the whole game, you got 3 points of value out of that card. However, if you attack with Sweeping Blow and then you immediately make a dragon with it, Sweeping Blow is then worth 4. But then you don't count that 1 extra resource as like value gained or lost from the dragon itself. Whatever life or damage it's dealt should be calculated independent of that ash, right?
So
it should then just be counted to however much value like the dragon itself gets.
So with our Mirror Guy example, you're saying that like we're saying Mirror Guy was worth 6 if it attacks for 2 and then gets attacked back for 4. So this ash that you're using to create Mirror Guy, if you're using this ash on Mirror Guy, that's kind of like
it's not.
I was gonna say that's kind of like an opportunity cost, because since you're making Mirror Guy out of this ash, you can't use this ash for something else.
I mean, what other resource in the game would you cut? Like, when I pitch a blue, you're giving up an opportunity cost because I'm casting this 1 card as opposed to using it to create like a rune chant with Grasp of the Arcanite. Like, you never say that about any other resource. In that, like, there's no opportunity cost for using like a resource for like not casting or being able to cast other cards. But why are we evaluating like for the resource of an ash?
So when you play Wounded Bull, you're spending 2 cards for 8. If you're assuming you're pitching a blue to pay for it, you're spending 2 cards for 8. So that second card, that pitch card, is being factored into the cost of the Wounded Bull. So like you're spending 2 cards in your action point for 8 points of damage. Right.
Yeah, but you wouldn't then say, well, then you also have to factor in the opportunity cost of not activating the Frost Hat. I forget its name right now. The crown of Coronet Peak. Sorry, yeah. Not activating Coronet Peak. You don't say, well, then you also have to take away the opportunity cost of not activating Coronet Peak when you cast Wounded Bull. Like that's so saying like you have to take away the opportunity cost of casting this dragon because it stops you from casting future dragons is weird to me.
So stating that you're spending 2 cards and your action point, that is kind of the opportunity cost. Like Coronet Peak costs 1 card in your action point versus Wounded Bull costs 2 cards in your action point. So like when we say I'm casting Mirror Guy, I'm spending 1 resource and the card for Mirror Guy and my ash, my dragon resource. And if instead of Mirror Guy I cast Kyloria instead or something, like then you don't subtract like any value or anything, but you are spending that cost, and that kind of needs to be. I guess you kind of are subtracting. Like it goes into the value of the card. So like, I'm like trying to like this.
Yeah, this is blowing my mind right now. Yeah, it's just every time I try to think back to like any other resource evaluation in the game, like what about like a tunic resource? Like, do you have to factor in the opportunity cost of using your tunic resource now as opposed to like maybe you need it on this next turn cycle? So like it's 1 resource generation is not always worth 1 resource generation.
I think 1 resource generation is worth 1 resource, but maybe you use your 1 resource to play like what's the 4 power guardian attack called? It makes it so that choke slam.
4 power guardian attack?
Yeah, you use tunic and pitch a blue to play choke
slam. 8 power? Yeah. 4 cost, 8 power. Cost. Yeah.
Sorry. Long day. Long podcast. So you play your choke slam.
I don't know what you're talking about. This podcast is only 40 minutes long, and whenever our listeners are watching.
That's true. We got a lot of things that have to be cut. So that's a tough one. So if you use that to play a choke slam, and then next turn you have a Command and Conquer plus a pummel, and you wish you had your tunic resource for that, then like
does that take away the past value of your choke slam?
It doesn't.
Okay.
So
then why does the future value and opportunity of creating a dragon take away from the present value of creating a dragon?
So you just kind of have to acknowledge the cost. Like Chokeslam costs your tuning resource. It's not like that resource is free. That resource costs your tuning activation. So that's kind of like
agreed.
Yeah. So when you're casting Mirror Guy, you're spending the cost of the ash. It's gone. You're spending it, it's gone. So
okay.
If Mirror Guy,
so that's just a resource used. So we don't need to bring in opportunity cost at all here.
Okay, that's fine. There's always that opportunity cost for using your resources. Cool. So this is probably not the best point to bring it up for the first time. Okay.
There's always an opportunity cost to everything. I could be using my time right now spending it with my wife and baby, but instead I'm here having a podcast discussing opportunity costs with Michael Hamilton. I have to weigh the pros and cons of that every time I get on this podcast.
Yes. So Mirror Guy, 6 points of value. Doesn't cost your action point because your dragons have go again because you played your thing. So 6 points of value for a card, a resource, and an ash. And if Mirror Guy lives an extra turn, then you're probably going to get 2 more points of value out of it because it'll probably get to attack again with go again. Go again. This turn, just like the previous turn. Yes. So by default, dragons' value is usually going to be their power plus their toughness. But sometimes they attack multiple times. Sometimes they have extra abilities, like Dromai generates an action point that can sometimes be worth extra. And then anytime they stay in play for multiple turns, they're worth even more than that because you just add how much they attack for each time they attack, basically, to how much value they generated over the course of the game. The last thing is if a dragon gets popped by a popper, then its value just, instead of being whatever it was, it just turned into 1 card from your opponent. So you spent a card and however many resources to cast it, and
a 6-power card.
And it trades for a single card.
It might have some premium to it, might not, depending on the matchup, right?
Yeah. Like they can't trade, so they can't trade any card for your dragon, but they can trade any 6-power card for it. So. Which
6-power plus, so like in a deck like Fi, where maybe they only have 3 poppers, like you're actually getting, you can say maybe your dragon is actually accruing like some minor form of value because you're taking this very specific resource away from like your opponent, or this very specific card type from your opponent that they won't have access to later. But against a deck like Oldheim, it's just like they have a million other poppers in their deck. It's not really doing much of anything at that point. So
yeah, and I'd also encourage you to look at it on a hand by hand basis rather than like amount of poppers in deck. So like if your dragon gets popped against Fi and on their turn they wanted to go 0 for 3 into Sword, into Phoenix Flame, into Lava Burst, then like that Command and Conquer in their hand wasn't going to do anything. Basically, it's basically there just to block a dragon. Like they can use it offensively, and they would probably be able to get some value out of it offensively. But like that's why it's in the deck, is because they're using it to pop the dragons.
Yeah, but in circumstances where maybe they had a mopey hand and Command and Conquer would have actually been the best thing that they could have cobbled together, you are accruing like some kind of positive value by taking away your opponent its like ability to like function on their turn. But that came up more so with like Prism math kind of a thing when you were attacking with Heralds, because you were just attacking with your Herald, but you weren't giving up your action point in order to do that because of Phantasmal Footsteps. So you're just taking away this powerful card from your opponent's hand but just trading 1 for 1 on your card on that level, and then you could follow it up with an aura or another powerful card or some kind of action in order to kind of like bring the game down a level and just slow it down. But Dromai doesn't really get that, because every time Dromai's Phantasm stuff pops, I guess specifically dragons, their turn is just over. That they lose their action point, so you can't keep trying to trade or like push for further value on your turn after exchanging one of your cards for a popper.
And then the last kind of thing about getting popped is if you have multiple cards in your hand when your dragon gets popped, you lose your action point, and you can't use these cards productively. Maybe you already have a card in arsenal and you have one more card left over in hand and your dragon gets popped, then that card's probably just wasted. So you're wasting a full extra card of value in addition to like your dragon not getting full value because it got popped. So that's not something you can like calculate what the value of your hand is going to be going into it. I guess it's like, actually you kind of can. It's kind of similar to like the Dorinthea where like this is the value of my hand if they don't pop anything and this is the value if they do pop me. And you can kind of calculate each of those cases.
Yeah.
So.
To be fair, I think this was a really like, I don't know if this was like a good episode in terms of like its quality, but I think I value this conversation a lot because if we go all the way back to Coach Hamilton's top tips, like Coach Hamilton's top tips were just like, look at your hand, evaluate it, get the most resources out of it. And we were like, yeah, cool. Yeah. Basic cards. We did the math. We're doing it. And now we're like, well, now it's really contextual based on like what the value of your hand is. And it's hard to know whether or not, you know, what these cards are worth. And you have to like evaluate like their different use cases and states. So I guess like this is kind of like what I was trying to get to the whole time. And I finally we finally, thanks to our lovely patron, to the more, I guess, like nuances and like better definitions of like flesh and blood hand evaluations and like value. So I don't know. That's just, take that for what it's worth.
Yeah. I'm glad that at least you feel good about the episode. I kind of think that it all ended up in a good place. And we talked about like some pretty weird cases, but I think we did kind of boil down how to evaluate some of these more complicated things. And hopefully this helps our listeners and viewers evaluate their hands. And yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. Do you have any closing thoughts on the value of the episode or cards or life in general? Or squeaky doors?
There's opportunity cost to everything. Sometimes you got squeaky doors.
I can say it better. Well, on that note, the next time you're evaluating the opportunity cost in your life, always remember the opportunity cost of not minding your manners.